I think it's a very long story for anyone to come to the conclusion of what the so-called scientific consensus says, that a single retroviral pathogen causes a highly amorphous immune deficiency syndrome. I've studied this. I think it was the original explanation, which was multifactorial causation. 3 parts to that. Number 1, gay men in the late 1970s, a dozen years into the sexual revolution, were spreading around old pathogens historically unprecedented. We were having sex with a dozen, scores, hundreds, even thousands of sexual partners. That intimate contact spreads old diseases, and that's immune suppressive, particularly in young, immune naive people. Number 2, in a historically unprecedented manner, we were using all kinds of toxins, from recreational drugs, alcohol, cocaine, amphetamines, poppers, nitrites, all of which were immune suppressive, to fuel a party lifestyle, which led us to that 3rd problem, and that is stress. Stress, particularly we found out in the last 30 years, is highly immune suppressive. Why were we stressed? The religious right was raising its ugly head, calling us evil, sinful. We were horrible people. Many of us were not out to our families. We were stressed. So, old pathogens, toxins, and stress all together in the way an insurance company actuary who studies morbidity and mortality could understand. All 3 of those things together, that's what caused immune deficiency. A subset of gay males had their immune systems collapsed. They were open to all kinds of diseases. Same thing in Africa. Has nothing to do with the retrovirus, has everything to do with lack of clean drinking water filled with pathogens, with malnutrition, both of which are immune suppressive, old diseases, malaria and tuberculosis, lack of proper sanitation, lack of proper hygiene, and a continent in stressful turmoil. That explains everything about AIDS in Africa. It is the biggest fraud in medical history and the most harmful.
So, what do you think is the cause of the pneumocystis pneumonia? Because what Michael Gottlieb told me is like these gay men were previously healthy, and then all of a sudden...
It is a myth that these gay men were previously healthy. They were frequently, if you take a look at the study done of men coming in for treatment in San Francisco, they were hustlers. They were people who took huge amounts of recreational drugs. It's simply part of the mythology to justify a claim that a retrovirus caused this disease. Pneumocystis pneumonia, it's not a bacterium. It was later found out to be a fungal infection. Exists in probably 98% of human beings. When immune system drops, when immune systems are impaired, you can be subject to any of the old pathogens that exist all the time in our bodies, and pneumocystis pneumonia was one of them. But that does not prove causation by a retrovirus. There are thousands of retroviruses out there. Many of them come into our body, read themselves into our DNA. They don't cause any disease. This is the only retrovirus in the history of retroviruses that's been claimed to cause any disease. And it was done because Gallo and Montagnier had been working a dozen years trying to make retroviruses cause cancer. They couldn't do it. They didn't want to waste all that work. So, voila, this is the retrovirus that causes AIDS. It was nonsense when it was propounded, and it's nonsense today, but a consensus has formed around it. Well, there was a consensus by the biggest enforcer of consensuses, and that is that the sun revolved around the earth until Galileo told us it wasn't so. But the consensus was enforced by 100 years by the Catholic Church. This consensus is enforced by a cult called the HIV equals AIDS cult.
Do you know about what Tony Lance thinks about the gut dysbiosis? What do you think about that?
One of the most important ways in which immune systems collapsed was because there was an interference in gay men of the intestinal microbiome. That is, the 10 trillion bacteria that live in our intestinal tract, from the stomach to the anus. We were compromising both ends of that with anal sex and with ingesting old pathogens. We were killing off the good bacteria in our guts. And I won't go into the graphic details of Tony's symbiosis, or I can't remember the exact word he's using for it. Dysbiosis, meaning dysfunctional symbiosis. But what was happening was we were attacking the front line of disease. 70 to 80% of our immunity is in our gut. Those 10 trillion bacteria keep the invaders, pathogenic invaders, from invading our system. But even more importantly, they allow us to ingest, or that is to say, they allow us to absorb nutrients. Malnutrition, once again, is the biggest problem with immune deficiency. We were basically destroying the ability of gay men to absorb nutrition.
And what about shower shots? Do you know about that?
Shower shots are a high-pressure water enema that gay men use before having anal sex to clear out the rectum. That high pressure pushes itself up deep into the intestinal tract, also interfering with the microbiome. Again, where 70 to 80% of our natural immunity resides.
Do they still do that a lot, though?
Yes, you can go to various places where things are sold to gay men, usually sex shops, and you will still see shower shots sold. You can go to a gay bathhouse and you will see in a vending machine shower shots sold. They're connected to a source of water in the restrooms. It's not uncommon. Another terrible thing that interfered with the microbiome was the practices called fisting, or putting toys into the lower intestinal tract. That also could tear the fine lining of this mucosal membrane. That could then allow fecal matter to get back into the bloodstream and cause blood poisoning. All kinds of ways that are well assessed that this, what I call the AIDS Fest here, the International AIDS Society Conference, wants to completely ignore, because they don't comport with their theory that this all was caused by a single pathogen. It is madness, is what it is. This is a multifactorial syndrome suppression of the immune system, which does not exist in the United States today. There is no AIDS epidemic in the United States. There is no AIDS epidemic in Africa. There is no HIV disease epidemic in Africa. It is the biggest fraud in medical history and the most harmful.
How come you told Gallo that you're not a denialist? What were you talking about then?
Well, I don't use the term denialist. I don't remember what you're alluding to. If someone says, "Are you a denialist?" I will say, of course I'm not a denialist. I'm not a genocidal maniac who believes there was no Holocaust. This is a loaded term that is your description of people who dissent from the single pathogen theory. And I'm certainly not going to buy into anybody's calling me a denialist. I don't have any thought that there wasn't a Holocaust. When people use that term denialist, they're trying to shut down debate. It's just like they use it with global warming. You're a denier of global warming, a denialist of global warming. In other words, they're saying you have no right to have an opinion that is out of sync with the consensus of the people, the 20,000 people who are here in this convention hall, who are part of the HIV/AIDS industry. They make their living around it. What would you expect them to do other than to continue this fraud? And most all of them are funded by U.S. government tax money. The people attending this AIDS Fest, or AIDS Drug Fest, you take a look at their expense accounts. They'll all track back to some effort by the United States government to recruit people to this conference. They are being paid by the universities, who get contracts from the National Institute of Health, from the CDC. I'll bet you that 80% of the people who are attending this conference make their livings, I call them parasites, HIV/AIDS parasites, out of this big fraud.
Tell a story about what happened to you when you were trying to get into the conference.
Okay. I applied for press credentials as the director of the Washington Center for Politics and Journalism, who is a freelance writer, has been for years on HIV and AIDS. I've been published in a couple of major newspapers and a website on Wall Street. I also do a lot of writing on my own, and I was denied that. No reason was given, other than I wasn't really a legitimate writer. Well, there are a lot of high school newspaper reporters here who haven't had a 40-year career in journalism as I have. I knew what they were doing. I knew they had researched me and found out that I was a, quote, denialist. So I made an appeal, and actually Dr. David Brown, the medical writer of the Washington Post, wrote a little note to the PR people saying, well, you ought to let him in or he'll make trouble, basically, because David Brown is part of the problem, as all American journalists are part of the problem because they believe this nonsense. Well, nothing happened. So I showed up here on the first day. I went to the press office. I asked to appeal my press credentials. The young man, his name is Sean Zane, who is the U.S. press secretary for this conference, said he couldn't help me. And I said, would you bring me your superior? He brought the woman, who's also named Sean, S-I-A-N, Bowen, who I think lives in Switzerland. She is the press officer for the International AIDS Society. She walked up to me, and the very first question she asked me, are you a denialist? It took me aback. I couldn't believe they would be that outrageous. And I said, a denialist? I don't deny anything about the Holocaust. How dare you call me a denialist or insinuate? She said, well, I wasn't calling you that, I'm just asking you a question. Because the conference does not allow any denialists in, whether it's press or whether it's attendees or whether it's exhibitors. So I said, look, this is outrageous. I want to appeal this to your boss. And she said, well, that would have to be the head of the International AIDS Society, the executive director. And I said, I don't know what it takes, but please find out. She walks away. 10 minutes later, she comes back. They'd apparently found out this might be a PR problem for them. She said, well, I want to make you a deal. We'll let you in, but you have to promise not to disrupt any speaker. And I said, I'm 65 years old, I'm pretty well trained, I know how to behave myself. I promise not to disrupt any major speakers. And she said, okay, then we'll let you in. And then they went back and they gave me this credential, which then shocked me, paid for by a drug company, Bristol Myers Squibb. Every single attendee has a pendant around their neck advertising one of the drug companies that sells the highly active antiretrovirals, or as we call it, the poison, the highly toxic chemotherapy.
You look good for your age.
Thank you.
Can you do that again where you touch your necklace?
Okay.
Like showing it?
Every single press person at this convention, every delegate, every exhibitor is given this pendant for their credentials, paid for by a drug company, the second biggest purveyor after Gilead Sciences of the highly toxic chemotherapy. Outrageous that they would make every attendee, including press, walking billboards for Bristol Myers Squibb.
Now, they also mentioned today about AZT being the first, cure, the first, not cure, but...
These people put their head in the sands. They will tell you that, yes, we got off to a slow start, but by 1987 we had the first treatment, AZT. What they don't tell you is that that treatment ended up killing tens of thousands of people, mostly people who weren't even ill, but who had simply tested positive for HIV. So they killed tens of thousands of people, and then they reduced the severity of the drugs. They reduced the doses. So people who had been taking it and gotten very ill from it, but were still alive, by the middle of the 1990s, they were given the drug cocktails, weaker versions of these nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors, still toxic in the long term, not in maybe the first 2 or 3 years, but certainly now we know in the last 10 or 15 years since gay men have been taking these, know how toxic they are. But they just want to ignore that whole AZT question because literally the HIV/AIDS establishment killed perhaps as many as 100,000 people with AZT.
So what kind of successes were they claiming for coming out with AZT?
Well, gay men, it was really a problem with gay men. Gay men were demanding, you've got to protect us from this pathogen. Gay men were in denial. They could not accept the fact that it was from our sexual behavior, from taking drugs, and from stress. They wanted to believe, gay men wanted to believe, ACT UP wanted to believe that it was a single pathogen. So they demanded the government, give us some drugs, find a vaccine. So the drug companies just readily complied. They pulled down off the shelf AZT, which had been formulated as a cancer chemotherapy in the 1960s, but it was so poisonous, they said it can't be used as a cancer chemotherapy. It was just, everyone was in denial. It was the FDA then started fast-tracking these drugs without any clinical trials that proved they were safe. So people just said, well, they're going to die anyway, so if we give them these drugs, you know, maybe they'll help them for a while. They did for about 3 or 4 months because they're cytotoxic. They kill cells. So if you had a bacteria in your body, or if you had another kind of pathogen in your body, in the very short term, they would kill those pathogens. Just like with cancer chemotherapy. You give somebody 6 weeks of a cancer regimen, you kill a bunch of the cancerous cells, and you hope you don't kill the patient. Except this was chemotherapy for life that these people were offering. I've seen what it's done to my friends. 2 friends have been taking this for 15 years. I've seen what it's done to their bodies. Lipoatrophy, facial wasting, lipodystrophy, extended stomachs, fat on the back, chronic diarrhea, immune suppressive, thinned limbs with protruding veins. All you have to do is walk around this conference and you can see those faces. You can see those bodies ravaged by these drugs. Their head is in the sand.
Yeah, we interviewed somebody yesterday who had he called it lipodystrophy, but I didn't see any.
Lipoatrophy is the wasting of fat in the face. Lipodystrophy is the redistribution of fat.
It looked like he had lipoatrophy, but he called
probably
it
has both. Yeah.
But anyway, he was saying he's never progressed to AIDS, and he's had HIV since 1982 or whatever number he said.
And the big question is, the big question is, did he ever have a presenting illness once he started taking these drugs? Did he just have a disease that could be accounted for by anything? Yes, the true believers in these drugs believe that they saved their lives. You can't prove it. There's no way to prove whether the illness they're now presenting with, which is liver dysfunction, renal disease, kidney problems, heart attacks like my friend Paul in New York had. Paul had a stroke and then he had a heart attack. He's 52 years old. He used to be in perfect health. I'm not saying that the body is pretty amazing. It can fend off all kinds of toxins, but it doesn't mean that those toxins don't take a toll on your body. And we see clearly, there's this wonderful piece in New York Magazine from November of 2009 showing the devastating impact of these drugs after 15 years on gay men in New York. Everybody's in denial here. I mean, would you expect a physician who prescribed one of these toxins that he would admit he's given somebody iatrogenic illness, that means doctor-induced illness? No, he would be sued in a minute if he admitted he was poisoning you. So they just keep their head in the sands and they keep on feeding people these highly toxic chemotherapies. And now these lunatics want to feed this chemotherapy to people who are HIV negative. That would be comparable to me going to my doctor, getting a handful of antibiotics before I go to the bathhouse on Saturday night to protect me from the bacterium. That would be medical malpractice if my doctor did that. It's medical malpractice for doctors to even consider giving highly toxic chemotherapy to people who test negative. This is how far this madness has gone, and that latter pre-exposure prophylaxis goes directly to Dr. Anthony Fauci for 28 years, the head of the National Institutes of Health's National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He has been colluding with the drug companies, particularly Gilead Pharmaceuticals, which sold $7 billion worth of this poison last year, trying to get them a new market for their Truvada. And he has succeeded. The FDA, just the week before this conference began, approved use of this chemotherapy in HIV negatives. It is a form of genocide, and that is not too strong a word for it.
Is Truvada one of the worst?
Truvada is the major antiretroviral made of 2 drugs. I can't remember their chemical names. It is the most widely prescribed now drug. Their Atripla comes close to it. They are the big villains in this. They're in Foster City, California. They sold almost $7 billion of their chemotherapy last year in a $17 billion drug segment of the pharmaceutical industry. Next highest was Bristol Myers Squibb, which sold about $3 billion. So they're more than twice. And they're the least known of all the drug companies. And they're the most politically connected. The chairman of their board, before he entered the George W. Bush administration, was Donald Rumsfeld, who became the Secretary of Defense. Reagan's Secretary of State, George H.W. Bush's special trade representative are all on their board. They are probably what's behind PEPFAR, all of which was done so they could increase the markets for their highly toxic chemotherapy.
What is PEPFAR?
PEPFAR is the president's, and I can't remember the exact words of the acronym, but it was under George Bush to give over 5 years $50 billion in U.S. taxpayer fund, mostly to Africa, mostly to combat HIV disease. What it really was for, I am convinced, was a payoff to Gilead Sciences and their great connections inside the Republican Party. But of course, liberals applaud Bush for this. Well, he had the Iraq War, but at least he's helping out these poor Africans with the life-saving treatments, with these new life-saving drugs. It's really a collusion between the right and the left. The left wants to blame the right for no condoms and no needle exchanges. The right wants to blame the left, saying, oh, it's these evil gay people and these poor black Africans, but we're going to bear the white man's burden here, and we are going to Christianize these unfortunate heathens in Africa by saving them from their sexually crazed selves. It's racism is what it is. It's homophobia and it's racism.
Is Truvada, it's not a protease inhibitor, right? What is
Truvada is a combination drug. I believe Truvada is a combination of a nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor and a protease inhibitor, but I can't swear to that. Frequently they're taken with other drugs. Truvada itself costs between $12,000 and $14,000 a year to Western patients, to patients who are having their drug bills paid by Medicare, Medicaid, or the AIDS Drug Assistance Program. That's how Gilead works its magic. It agrees to give the poor Africans $100 worth of these drugs, but Westerners in return have to pay the full bill. It's just the way drug companies do this all the time. They get most large expense drugs, they jack up the price of the drugs, and then they create a situation where the U.S. taxpayers pay these extravagant fees for these drugs. And in return, they'll do their Christian duty and give more money to the Africans. Okay?